And when you talk to Apple, what kind of reaction are you getting to your micromobility pitch?
Okay, that's yes, I haven't found reason to reject my own original assumptions, which are about lightness and smallness, inculcated in my mind by the great Gordon Murray, one of the greatest car designers in the world, in Formula One, in particular in supercars. And he understood lightness, and he designed microcars and drove tiny little cars. So you can imagine what an impression that made on me. And I was thinking about his approach back in 2008, and so that influenced me a lot in terms of thinking about mobility. And you once you see it through that lens of size and weight, you just realize that it makes no sense at all, that the world around us is completely broken. I mean, it's fundamentally, it came to me, Negroponte there was a gentleman named Negroponte who ran Media Lab at MIT. And his name came associated with this thing called the Negroponte switch, because back in the 80s, he said, look, we're talking to each other using landlines, and we're watching television over the air. And he, being an engineer in physics and knowing all he knew, said, this is completely upside down. There's no, wires are high bandwidth. The air is extremely constrained in bandwidth. We cannot put that much signal through the air. And you shouldn't be broadcasting television over the air and sending voice over metal wire. And he just said it's going to flip. It has to. The physics tell you, as demand increases for bandwidth, you're going to have to put that video somewhere else. As it turns out, we ended up with cellular, where they're both in the air, but still the heaviest stuff goes through the wires and fiber eventually. And so that came to be known as the Negroponte switch, is just observing an absurdity and saying it's going to be reversed. And by the way, the reason it was absurd is because it had a legacy. It depended on when the things were invented and the infrastructures that were built. And so all I'm saying is that with micromobility, I'm just observing a world that's completely upside down in terms of efficiencies and the logic of trying to move 7 billion people. Right now, automobiles only move 1 billion people, so there's about 6 to 7 that aren't being mobilized, and we can't bring that mobility to them because these machines weigh 10 times more than they need to, take up 10 times the space and 10 times the energy, and kill the planet. And all those things, even if they're electric, they're still supremely inefficient for the work they do. Anyway, all of this aside, I even when presenting this material, as I talked about decades ago about smartphones and decades ago about media, and I said things are going to go to our pockets and things are going to get small. You tell it 20 years in advance and you are a maniac. You are an absolute raving lunatic. Eventually it's obvious. Eventually everybody says, and nobody even thinks that it's happened, but that's the way I feel, and maybe it'll take longer than 20, and I'm trying to accelerate it as much as possible. As far as Apple's concerned, if I'm right, they'll be doing this. Absolutely. In fact, everybody will. There will be no company in the world that will not be involved in transportation and doing micromobility or energy systems for that matter. Whether they're first, second, third, or last, I don't know. It's going to be up to them. They need to have humility. They need to have all the things. I think Jobs, and I hate to say this, I think Jobs would get in like that. I think he was a motorcycle rider. He understood the value of small. He understood all that stuff. He was intuitively, a micro guy. But as far as the current management, and there is a sense of like, okay, can we add value? And you have to understand, what is your frame of reference? Are you adding the value to the vehicle? Are you adding the value to the smart helmet, which, by the way, is a killer app for augmented reality? And it'll, you get to paint the world with a whole new brush. And so your design space is the world around you. And that's an interesting space for every developer in the world. Do you want to make that happen? And if so, how? What's the path? or they could wait until the market reaches like 2-3% penetration, and then you jump in. And that's been historically the case. So, I think they'll get there. But I said this again of every other maker of computers, that you're going to be in mobile or you're not going to exist. And it's just a matter of how you do it, and whether you get in early enough to really make a difference.